Hello, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this third webinar on the Global Internal Audit Standards. So today we will be looking at domain 3. But first of all, let me briefly introduce the usual thing about Sigma, which is a joint initiative of the OECD and the EU, and is mainly financed by the European Union. And we are organizing this series of webinars on the new Global Internal Audit Standards for candidate countries, potential candidates, and neighbor countries to the EU in the framework of our support activities in the field of internal audit. So the third webinar, as I said, will focus on domain 3, which comprises the principles and standards for governing the internal audit function. Having appropriate governance arrangements is essential to enable an effective internal audit function. The domain outlines mainly two aspects. First of all, the requirements for the heads of internal audit to work closely with the leaders of the institution to establish internal audit function, position it independently, and oversee its performance. But the second aspect is also the senior management responsibilities or the responsibilities of the board, if there is one, to guarantee essential conditions to support and promote the strong governance of the internal audit function, and also to establish the foundation for an effective dialogue between senior management, the board, if there is one, and the head of internal audit. So with this short introduction, I will now hand over to John, who will be presenting domain 3. Over to you, John. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Pilar, and good afternoon, everyone. I hope that you're all well and that you're beginning to enjoy some nice weather as we move through to the summer. I think I was in Yerevan, Armenia, last time we did the webinar. It probably was Armenia. And I'm here again in Armenia this week, so slightly ahead of many of you time-wise. So it's good to be back, and welcome very much to our third session, as Pilar said, on looking at the global internal audit standards and thinking particularly how they've changed and what else we need to do as heads of audit and internal auditors to ensure that we properly conform and comply with the new requirements and the raised bar for us as internal auditors. We will be talking for just over an hour, about an hour and 10, 15 minutes or so. We'll have time for questions. After that, if you have questions as we go along, as we said at the very beginning, please put them into the chat or the question and answer field there. And as soon as I see them, I'll pause and try to answer them as we go along, or we'll leave a little time at the end for questions as well. You'll certainly have access to the slides too. We'll happily share those with you after the event. So you certainly don't have to sit there writing lots of things down. In fact, most of the words in most of the slides come directly from the Global Internal Audit Standards anyway. So a big welcome, and if you're sitting comfortably, we'll get underway as usual. To recap very briefly, you'll know the existing standards and IPPF that we work to. It's been around for about 7 years. The Global Institute thought it was time for a refresh and an update. And as you know, this sort of time last year issued a set of draft Global Internal Audit Standards for comment and feedback. Many of us provided our feedback. The Institute worked through all of that, and on the 9th of January 2024 published the finalised IPPF comprising the Global Internal Audit Standards and these new topical requirements as well. We're focusing on the Global Internal Audit Standards today, that main component of it. I should say, I forgot, if you haven't been on one of these calls before, my name's John, 25 years nearly doing audit and governance roles for several different organisations in the UK. Now I've been a head of audit and done all of that Now I chair an audit committee. I'm a member of 3 other audit committees, and I spend my time delivering training and capacity building work in the field of audit and risk management across Europe and the Middle East. So I travel a lot, which is why I'm back in sunny Yerevan. So forgot to mention who I am. So we have our 2024 Global Internal Audit Standards. They go live formally on the 9th of January next year. So the clock is ticking. And I know that many of you are sort of beginning to work through these to take a look at what elements of your practices may need to change and be adapted to ensure that you continue to conform with these going forward. 6 months, just over 6 months to go. So I can't believe we're in June already, and the time till January is going to go very, very quickly indeed. So if you haven't started sort of doing a gap analysis between your practices now and these new standards, kind of now's the time to get that underway. Because I'm sure that there will be some changes that are needed pretty much for every audit function anywhere. So there we go. Get on with that as soon as you can. The structure of the standards, we've touched upon this before, 5 domains, 15 sort of principles that replace the core principles in the existing standards. We've got 52 standards made up of requirements, things that we have to do, and considerations for implementation, things that we could do, and examples helpfully of what we may need to do or could do to comply with these standards going forward. Um, so that's the sort of structure of them. In addition to the standards themselves, we've got sort of fundamentals that talk about internal audit's role in serving the public interest primarily. A separate section on how we apply these standards to the public sector, something that will be of interest to many of you, I know. And I did see at the very start of this week that IIA Global have updated their guidance on internal audit in the public sector. So there's now a second edition of that. So well worth looking at that on the global website if you've not seen that update. And then a glossary that is different and updated from the glossary in the existing IPPF and introduces some new terms and some new definitions for us all to pay attention to and to consider in our work. So well worth looking at those as well. The structure of the Global Internal Audit Standards looks a little bit like this in a more sort of colourful way. We've got these 5 domains, and today, as we know, we'll be looking at the 3rd domain, governing the internal audit function. As Pilar said, it's all about the role of the board or whoever ultimately internal audit are reporting to in our organisations. The Institute have called it the board, but the reality is for many of you, it will be a minister, it may be an audit committee, it may even be some other governing body in an organisation or another senior manager. So the Institute use the term board, and before we go any further, it will be really, really important for you to consider carefully who the board are or is in your organisation. Because as Pilar said, there's specific responsibilities for the board detailed in these new standards. And so clarity over who plays the role of the board, who plays the role of senior management, who plays the role of an audit committee, if you've got one, all of that would be very, very important indeed going forward. I'm just going to say, Alastair, we can see you walking. So just in case you didn't know, we can see you strolling through the streets of wherever you are. So just in case you wanted to blank your screen. So we've got a key decision to make ultimately for senior management and audit committee, as we said. I'll touch more upon that in just a little while. The 7th element within this domain is around the independent positioning of the internal audit service. It's critically important that internal audit have the ability to operate independently within an organisation. and to have sufficient status and the right position and reporting lines to facilitate that. Otherwise, there can be dangers, of course, to our objectivity. There can be untoward pressure put upon us, and it may be suboptimal for us to be reporting inappropriately in an organisation for a number of different reasons. So the independent position allows us to deliver our work with objectivity, and it's critical for the success of a meaningful internal audit service anywhere. And the last part within this domain, again, as Pilar said, our work is overseen by the board. And for many of us in the past, we had this sort of reporting line to a minister or to an audit committee, but often it was there on paper, but perhaps wasn't exercised quite so well or so usefully in practice. Our standards now require us to be having much more um, useful and regular discussions with the board, with our senior stakeholders, and the onus is on us to really make them aware of their role and responsibilities in respect of us. So I think there's going to have to be much more ongoing dialogue and discussion with our key stakeholders than was ever envisaged previously under our existing IPPF. We'll touch upon that as we work through today. So it's the structure and something that you're familiar with. We've looked at it before. Domain 3 is our area of focus today. We've got about 9 key standards within these. Some of the standards within domain 3, section 6, pretty familiar in large part. We talk about an internal audit mandate, covering our purpose, authority, responsibility, accountability, etc. We talk about documenting that in a charter. And then we've got this sort of slightly expanded element of board and senior management support. We spoke a little bit about independence, but there's a separate standard here about our own qualifications, experience, knowledge, skills, and certifications. Try to the standard for us and to ensure that our organisations are getting a good internal audit service from a good internal audit professional heading the function. We'll talk a little bit about that in a while. And then the overseen by the board bit, as it says here, the board, minister, audit committee, whoever it might be, oversees us. Why? To ensure that we're effective. And so that requires them to do certain things. It requires us and them to engage from time to time in practice and not just on paper. So this dialogue, this communication, this reporting. There's a section around resources and making sure that internal audit have a sufficient level of resources to deliver the assurance that our key stakeholders want and need from us. There's standards around quality and ensuring an effective quality assurance and improvement program, replacing some of the 1300 standards that we're familiar with already. And then the requirement to plan and undertake these external quality assessments at least once every 5 years. And in fact, I'm doing 2 external quality assessments at the moment, one here in Armenia and one remotely with colleagues in the UK. So external quality assessments remain just as important in the new standards as they are under familiar existing standards. I mentioned the glossary, and we've got some definitions within the glossary that certainly help us with parts of domain 3. We've got the idea of a board, and as I said, it's fundamentally important that you have a clear and agreed view of who the board is or are in your organizations now and, of course, going forward. Obviously, there'll be some substitution of the term board for whoever carries out that role in your organization. So it's fundamentally important that we've got a clear idea and whoever this person or individual is or are, that they accept that responsibility as well. And that may well require us to have this conversation and discussion with them. You can see that different bodies, different teams, different groups, even individuals could play the part of the board in an organisation. In many of your organisations, it will be minister, of course. Some of you will have audit committees. Some of you may even have audit committees with independent members on them. That body could fulfil that role as well, of course. And that's the direction that many of our organisations are beginning gradually to go to, but not everyone, of course. So, step number one, be absolutely clear who the board is for you and for your organisation. And then think a little bit about what that means in relation to these standards and your relationship with this team, group, or individual. We've got some other elements within the glossary that are relevant. We talk about the board and senior management regularly. So again, we'll need to be clear for ourselves who we mean by the term senior management for us and for our organisation, of course. The Institute refer to senior management as the highest level of executive management, sort of CEO, if you like, in an organisation. Oh, I see a question. So let me just pause and read the question. Out of this domain, right, the should and must issues. I'm just coming on to that. So thank you very much indeed for mentioning it. The question basically is about the kind of difference and what we mean by should and must. And you'll see some words here on the rest of the slide. So I will come to that in just a minute, Mr. or Mrs. Anonymous. So senior management, typically some sort of chief executive, some sort of senior civil servant in a public sector environment, ultimately someone who is accountable to the minister, leading the organisation. It might be that there is some overlap in your organisations between senior management, who might be deputy directors, deputy ministers or assistant ministers, and executives. So you may need some clarity again over who fulfills that senior management role in your organisations. Now, coming to the words should and must and may. In English, each of these words means slightly different things. I appreciate that in other languages, sometimes there is overlap and sometimes there is one word that's used for each of these three words in English. Language can be a funny thing, can't it? As we all know. So it is very, very important. I should say, of course, that the Institute are working with IIA chapters around the world to ensure that these standards are translated into other languages. They're working through that fairly quickly, actually. And of course, we have seen the standards, just got my pen, we have seen the standards translated into other languages already. But if you're involved in doing this or helping with this process yourselves, it is very, very important that you pay attention to these distinctions between these words. Most powerful of these three words, the most compelling of these three words, is the word must. And the word must is used regularly throughout the standard. And it's kind of mandatory. It means that we as internal auditors absolutely have to do something. It's not optional. There's no maybe about it. It's compulsory, it's mandatory. We have to do it. The second level of compulsion is the word should. And the word should is something that is less strong and less compelling than the word must. The word should cover situations that are important and represent good practice, but we don't absolutely have to follow these or do these if there's good reasons why not. Okay, if there's good reasons why not. There are many things that I should do. I should exercise more. I should eat more healthily. It doesn't mean that I'm always going to do that. I know that I should, and that represents a good or best practice, but maybe other things get in the way, or I have other priorities. So the word should is not as mandatory as the word must. And then we have this third word, the word may. And the word may very much is optional. We can do it, we don't have to do it. And there's no sort of penalty, no sort of hardship for us if we don't. So we have this order. Must is most important. Should is pretty important, and there should be good reasons for us to try to follow and to do what is said. And may, which very much is optional. Okay, so those are the main differences between these three words. When it comes to the standards and the requirements within the standards, we'll see that the Institute use the word must an awful lot. Okay? There's lots of things that we really absolutely to do as internal audit teams if we want to conform with these standards. In some of the sort of expanded narrative around standards, they use the word should quite frequently. So there we go. I hope that helps and deals with that question. A couple of things that people have commented upon previously as well is particularly around the term mandate. We didn't really use the word mandate quite so obviously and clearly in the existing international professional practices framework and the existing standards. Now the term mandate is very much explicitly covered by the Institute, and it is all about our authority, role, and responsibilities given to us under legislation or regulation, if we have those in the countries in which we're operating, or our authority, role, and responsibilities given to us by the board. The Charter is ultimately the document that contains the mandate. But it includes some other things as well, as you can see here. It will describe our position in the organisation, our reporting lines, both administratively and in terms of the work itself. It covers what we do as an internal audit service and sometimes what we don't do as an audit service. So we're not responsible usually for management activity and other functions, the scope of our work. It may contain the types of services that we do, the assurance work that we carry out, the advisory work that we undertake, and potentially our role responsibility in respect of fraud or investigations or risk management, the types of services. It may cover the types of audit work that we carry out, if those are defined in legislation somewhere, financial audits, compliance audits, etc., if we have to define them in a particular way. So the Charter is a document that includes our mandate and these other actions or activities that help show what our internal audit service is all about. I've just seen a question. Hi, Katia. I'm not really in a position to translate this material into Georgian. I'm sure colleagues there within Georgia, whether it's the Central Harmonization Unit of the Ministry of Finance, will be thinking about the new Global Internal Audit Standards and may well be thinking about translating these into Georgian. We'll certainly be sharing the material in English, but it's a little bit beyond our remit at the moment to translate it into all the languages that are required. It's a kind of watch this space. I'm sure it will be available in Georgian, you know, at some point, but it's beyond us and our ability to do that today, I'm afraid. It's lovely to have you on the call, though, today, and great to see you. I'm a jobber. Okay, going to move on just a little bit. So the main three. And to give, I'm not going to talk through every word. I said this before. I'm going to focus on the most important bits from the standards and from the principles in these areas. What's domain 3 all about? Well, Pilar introduced it to us. It's about how we as chief audit executives, as internal audit leaders and teams, um, how we engage more closely with our key stakeholder or stakeholders, the board ideally, what we need from them to properly establish the internal audit service effectively in our organisation and ensure its appropriate independence, and how they oversee our performance and hold us to account for delivering a good, high quality, impactful internal audit service in line with the global internal audit standards. Okay, they need to recognize that they have a responsibility in respect of internal audit, and they need to exercise that responsibility too, just like uh, the responsibility over any function within an organization. Could we share the material with attendees? We're going to share the material with attendees. As I said, most of it is taken from the Global Internal Audit Standards themselves. So very few of the slides contain extra information, but you will be getting these afterwards. And it says here, as participants, we can't see questions unless the questions are sent anonymously. But I read the questions before answering. I'll make sure that I do that in future. The only questions we've had so far are around the difference between the terms should and must. And I've covered that. Could the material be translated into Georgian? That was the question I've just answered. Will we share the material? Absolutely, we will in English. And I've certainly read the questions. That's a very fair point, and thank you for letting me know. All right, thanks again for the questions. So the this is all about establishing and maintaining an effective relationship between us, the board, and senior management. It describes the role and responsibilities, really, of all three parties in this. There are some things that we're responsible for as internal audit, but there are some things that we will have to talk to the board and senior management about because they will be responsible for some of these things. So they're not going to know this necessarily unless we talk to them about it. So there is an opportunity here to set up meetings to make sure that we're clear about our role and responsibilities and their role and responsibilities in line with these standards. And then discussion about that to ensure that they are properly aware of their obligations and responsibilities in respect of us as internal audit. Could that be a difficult conversation? Might they be too busy to want to talk to us? Yes, and yes, it might be a difficult conversation. They may not be terribly interested. They may have lots of other roles and responsibilities to carry out. But the onus and the requirement is on us to have that dialogue, communication, and engagement with them. There are, as it says at the bottom of this slide, some essential conditions associated with each standard that try to kind of communicate and set out the different roles and responsibilities in these areas. So it's well worth having a look at those and maybe preparing a presentation to deliver yourselves to the board and or senior management in your organisation. The IIA say that the chief audit executive must discuss this domain with the board and senior management. So that's mandatory. That's obligatory. We don't have a choice. We've got to have that kind of conversation. And it can be through a meeting, of course. It could be in person or online. It could be through a presentation. It could be through ongoing dialogue at regular meetings, of course, gradually helping our stakeholders understand their respective roles and responsibilities over us. It may not be a one-off thing, it may be an ongoing program of communications and influencing. So it's something that we've got to do. The onus and responsibility is on us. We've got to discuss all of this with the board and senior management. What do these conversations need to focus on? It needs to focus on the new stated purpose of internal auditing that we touched upon in our first webinar. Talks very much about what internal audit in a modern environment is trying to do and how we work and the value that we try to deliver. Very important that we need to ensure our stakeholders have this modern understanding of what a good practice internal audit service should be doing. Second thing, each of the main conditions under domain 3 that we're going to walk through very quickly, and what happens if the support that we need from the board and senior management isn't provided, because there will be some consequences and some implications for the internal audit service if people, key stakeholders, don't provide the level of support and engagement that the standards expect. We won't be able to do everything that we're expected to do by the IIA. So there are consequences for actions. There are consequences for inactions. There can be consequences too, as well. Now, the discussions that we have will vary in nature, and the Institute isn't prescriptive about this. I'm sure many of you will meet with the Minister or with the Audit Committee a few times a year. It may be an annual activity. It may, and I hope it is, more frequent than that. It tends to be more frequent if they really do sort of value our insight and the work that we do. So the nature of the conversations we have around this domain are going to have to fit our organization and the way in which things work in our organization. If you don't have regular meetings with the minister, and the minister represents the board in your context, then you're going to have to timetable up a meeting. You're going to have to make this happen ultimately. Now, there may be some other situations when we would want to sit down and talk this domain through with our stakeholders. If the standards change, if we are newly appointed to an organisation, if a new minister or a new board is established in our organisation, all of those will require us to repeat the message and to, update the individual or group or committee that we're working with on the things that have changed. So it's not going to be a one-off, done once and that's it activity. It may need repeating from time to time. Now, there are, as we said, some essential conditions within these standards, and we'll look at some of them today. But it might be that we get disagreement or resistance to some of these from some of our stakeholders. A minister might say, I'm not going to do this. Senior management may say, we're not interested in this. The law for audit doesn't cover this. Well, if there are disagreements over elements of these essential conditions, then we need to try to persuade our stakeholders of why it's important to do what the standards are saying. And if we're unsuccessful in that persuasion and negotiation, then we have to explain what the consequences are going to be in terms of our ability to conform or comply with these standards. So if there is resistance, we try to deal with that and address that. If we're unsuccessful, and we're not always successful, then we have to explain clearly and simply what the consequences are for our ability to comply with these standards. It may mean that we're not able to fully comply with a particular standard. It might be that we're only able to partially comply with the standard. Or if it's a significant element within the standard, it may be that we're not able to comply with the standard at all. So these things can be important. They do need to be discussed, and the consequences certainly need to be explained. So that's pretty important. Okay, moving on. We've got sort of three main principles within domain three. The first principle is that it's all about the approval and authorization by the board of us, our work, in the internal audit function. So the principle itself is pretty clear. The board, whoever that may be, establishes, approves, and supports the mandate of the internal audit function. As we said, the mandate is about our accountability, our responsibility, what we do and how we do it. The mandate will typically come from the board, but of course, in many of your countries, in many countries around the world, the mandate for internal audit is included within the relevant law for internal audit or financial control or financial management within your countries. On that note, I'm guessing that Ministry of Finances around the world will be looking at these new standards and thinking about how to incorporate them in any update to the legislation in your jurisdictions. So obviously there may be a delay in some of these changes making their way into law. And it's very important that laws be updated, I think, to recognise these changes within the global internal audit standard. So the mandate might come from the law, might come from the board, and it, as it says here, specifies our authority, role, responsibilities. It needs to be documented like most good things, and our mandate is typically documented in our audit charter or our audit terms of reference, whatever we call it. I kind of like to have a charter. I can sort of wave it at people if I need to, and occasionally I can use it to explain, why we are going to carry out this particular audit at this particular time, because my mandate and my charter allow it. So occasionally we can wave it at people if we're getting kind of resistance or pushback when it comes to us doing our audit work, of course. So the principle, pretty standard, and the words kind of, I hope, make good sense to us. Beneath the principle, we have three relevant standards, standards 6.1, 2, and 3. The mandate needs to come from us ultimately. We need to give the board and senior management the information they need to generate the mandate for us. It might be as simple as saying, here's the law and this is what we've got to do, dear minister. And we're going to write this into a charter and we'll need you to approve it. It might be a conversation with the audit committee. The law says this, this is what we're going to do, and these are the other things that we're going to include within our organisation and within our mandate, and we're going to record these in the charter. We're going to bring this to you each year. You're going to review it and check that you continue to be happy with it. So like most things, the sort of charter is drafted probably by ourselves, shared with our stakeholders. It ought to align with any legislation, of course, in our countries. And ideally, it needs to align and meet the requirements of these global internal audit standards. So there may be some conversations around this, some explanations of why this is in there or why that's in there. But very important that those conversations and that dialogue occurs. So I think pretty much every audit team anywhere is going to have to be looking at their charter and making sure that the charter covers what these standards require, and that the mandate is refreshed and updated if it needs to be, and it needs to be approved or reapproved by the board in our organisations. So again, that's a definite job pretty much for all of us anywhere, I would say. Is my mandate still accurate? Is my charter still up to date? What do I need to do with my charter to ensure that it still allows us to comply with these global internal audit standards? I think many of you will have charters. The concept of a charter has been around for a number of years and is included in our existing standards. It's the content of the charter that might have to change a little bit. So we've got our essential conditions, and as we said earlier, these are the things that we may have to sit down with the board and with senior management to discuss, and we need to get them on board and agreeing to these things. If they don't, we need to try to persuade them, and we'll have to think through the consequences for our ability to comply with this if they don't agree. Okay, thank you, Guram. A question on the chat from Guram here. The sort of meetings that I've been talking about and the discussions that I've mentioned, the question is, how necessary are they to be documented and signed by both parties? Well, it does depend a little bit on the culture within your organisation and how things are done in your organisation. Um, I tend to do these things fairly informally, to tell you the truth. I don't generally require people to sign that they agree with what I've written and that we've had the meeting and this was what was said. But I do appreciate that in other jurisdictions and in other locations and types of organizations, it is standard practice for meetings like these to be recorded and then for both parties to sign to say this is an accurate view of the meeting. So it does depend, I'm afraid. It's not a clear question, a clear answer from me. I think when it comes to reviewing, say, a charter and recording that the annual review of a charter has taken place by the board, by the audit committee, I think that needs to be recorded in proper minutes of the meeting to demonstrate that that's happened. But I think if it's me sitting down with you, talking this through, if we're all in agreement and if we've got a good relationship between us, we can perhaps be a little less formal. If the culture is such that we need to kind of have this on record and be able to refer back to it if needed, in the future, then let's write it up. Let's share the record with our colleagues or stakeholders, and if appropriate, and if it helps, get them to acknowledge receipt and that they have no questions or concerns or they agree with it. It depends. Thank you for the question. Okay, so we've got these essential conditions. Obviously, these ones are pretty straightforward. There's nothing too difficult here. I think the only interesting one is the second one under senior management. Senior management, it's essential that they support the internal audit mandate across the organisation. In other words, they allow us to do our job and undertake our role effectively and promote and support the authority granted to us. So if you are facing resistance, if you are facing difficulty with some senior managers, they're not following what this statement is saying. So we might want to have some sort of conversation with them or some sort of concerns raised to the board about the lack of cooperation or assistance from some stakeholders. Now, we've said that we go on to talk about conditions for implementation. This is where we sometimes see the word should used. And you can see the word should used in the middle paragraph here. The head of audit should discuss with the board and senior management this sort of thing, the charter and all of this. So it's not absolutely compulsory, but it is good practice. And I'd strongly encourage it, as the Institute do as well. Things that are should represent good practice. So we might well need to communicate our charter and mandate to our key stakeholders from time to time to remind them of it. And that's basically what this is saying. Charters, pretty much we've touched upon, and I know many of you will be familiar with them, covering the usual sorts of things, our purpose and purpose of internal audit and internal auditing, our desire to comply with or conform with the Global Internal Audit Standards, and then our authority, responsibility, reporting lines, etc. So, we should be reviewing our charter regularly ourselves anyway, to ensure that it remains fit for purpose. These new global internal audit standards give us another reason why we should do that. So do take the opportunity to refresh it, to reflect on it, and to ensure that your charters really are useful documents that properly capture your purpose, authority, responsibility, and all of that. And these standards give you a good opportunity to do that. And if needed, to kind of ensure that the charter's really kind of pushing the audit function forwards as it should. Now, there are some essential conditions here as well. So there should be these conversations about what goes in the charter. It's the board ultimately who should approve the internal audit charter. So that might be the minister, it might be the audit committee, it may be somebody else. And obviously, this needs to be reviewed from time to time to ensure that it's still relevant and valid. Certainly, we talk about some sort of annual review. Is the charter still okay? Yes, it is. All right. Well, we might want to just have that conversation with the board in one of our regular catch-up. We've reviewed the audit charter. It remains current and up to date. Are you happy with it, boss? Okay. And obviously, it may well be sensible to go out and talk to senior management about this as well, particularly if we're updating things that brings additional responsibilities or obligations on them. We do have key stakeholders within senior management. Talking to them about this, involving them in updates would represent good practice as well, of course. Standard 6.2 talks about, and the considerations talk about charters including the reporting responsibilities. So who approves our budgets, financial resources, who approves our people and team resources, the HR side of things, who approves my expenses if I'm the chief audit executive, who do I have to get sign off uh, from to cover those? And how does my performance be reviewed and by who? And there's things that we might want to consider there. Obviously, if I'm working directly to a minister, it's probably the minister who determines my performance and how happy they are with it at the end of the year. Should it be senior management? Maybe, maybe not. It does depend. It's a little bit difficult if people who I'm auditing can control my performance appraisal at the end of the year. Obviously, there's a particular challenge there for my objectivity and pressure that could be put upon me if inappropriate people have a say in my performance. So I always like to see that a head of audit's performance and end of year appraisal, at the very least, has some input from the audit committee as part of that. If there is an audit committee, certainly some sort of a idea of who has a role to play in this process to ensure that it's fair, that it's transparent, and that it doesn't influence me in terms of how I carry out the work. These things need to be recorded and registered. Someone's just sent me a picture of me doing this talk. So thank you very much for sending that. It's lovely to have you on the session as well. Standard 6.3, the last one in this section. We have to deliver and provide information to our key stakeholders in order for them to have a clear and appropriate understanding of who we are and our role and our responsibilities. Also, if they understand what we do and how we do it, they can support that in the conversations that they're having with their teams and their people, of course. If their understanding of internal audit is kind of low, then the teams that they're responsible for probably won't have a great understanding of internal audit either. So there is a responsibility on us to ensure that our key stakeholders have got a sensible and appropriate understanding of us and our role and responsibility, and then can share this knowledge more effectively with their people. So dialogue, communications, and all of that. Once again, you can see how important communications are to this domain. Now, there are some essential conditions that we will have to inform the board about. We need them to act as champions for us. And that's really important because internal audit can only do their job properly, professionally, objectively. We've got some good top cover supporting us. I was very lucky in my last organization to be working to the right people, and they certainly had a good understanding of what internal audit was there to do and how we did it. And I knew that if I had a particular problem or a particular challenge um, during an audit or with a part of the organization, I knew that these people would support me. The audit committee were there to help protect and promote internal audit and its ability to do its work. So we might want to have that kind of conversation with the minister if we're working to a minister, certainly to the audit committee if we're working to them. We need them to be our champions and to be our top cover. So we need to work on them with them. We certainly need them to support our ability to go anywhere and do anything. This unrestricted access. Again, as a head of audit, I need the ability to go and look at anything I want to. If it's necessary for the work that we're doing. Again, I need that recorded in the charter, of course. There are other things that they can do to demonstrate support, and again, things that we would encourage them to do for us. They should ensure that we have the right reporting lines, the right status within the organization in order to have the credibility and the position to do our work effectively across the organization. They've got to approve the charter, but also importantly, approve our plan, our budget, and our resources. That's very, very important indeed. It might be that resources are tight and we don't have sufficient resources in the organization to do everything that we would want, but internal audit certainly needs sufficient resources in order to play the assurance and advisory role that's needed. So there may have to be difficult conversations about resourcing, and we'll come on to those in just a little while. The ability to carry out our work without restrictions, very important, of course. There shouldn't be any restrictions on us or our work. And regular meetings, including meetings where it's just us and the board without senior management present. All of those allow us to do our work effectively. The senior management, we're looking for them to support us as we carry out our work across the organisation, to assist us, to make their people aware of the importance of us and our work, and to again contribute towards the success of our internal audits. So there we go. Role for both the board and senior management in respect of us. the emphasis is on us to ensure that our stakeholders are aware of this and follow this. Of course, we have to tell them to help us ultimately, or ask them to help us if we wanted to put it more diplomatically. Okay, the second principle we'll look at today very briefly is around independence and the position of internal audit. The board, again, establishes and should protect our independence and our qualifications, our ability to do the job because we have the right knowledge, skills, experience, and certifications. I could easily set up an internal audit team in the organisation, but that internal audit team may not be very good if I don't put the emphasis on the resourcing and the qualifications that are needed. We've certainly spoken previously about the challenges associated with very small internal audit teams. And it's very difficult to have all the right expertise in order to do the job properly if we're starved of resources. So there is this obligation and requirement for us, and to be talking about this with our stakeholders, and to give them bad news if we haven't got the right resources or the right status or the right position. We're going to have to speak up and say this is causing us problems, and makes it harder for us to give you the assurances you need if you're starving us of resources. So independence, we know a little bit about that. Of course, it's one of the most important aspects of us as a function, coupled with the objectivity that we have as individual internal auditors. It says here, we're only able to fulfill the purpose of internal audit if we report directly to the board. And I know not everybody does, so this is something that we might need to think about. And again, begin to be warming up our stakeholders that things might have to change. This should have been the case previously. It hasn't always been the case. But now with these new global internal audit standards, maybe it gives us another opportunity to revisit this and to have those conversations once again. Global IA is saying that we can't deliver the purpose of internal auditing. We don't report directly to the board. It goes on to say, we need to be qualified. And that can be through local certifications. Of course, I know that many of you work in jurisdictions where there are local internal audit certifications, and that may be sufficient to meet the standard. But of course, the IA also promotes its own certifications, things like the CIA certificate, of course. There are certificates and qualifications from accountancy bodies that may be relevant, at least in part, for this as well. But qualifications are important. We can be a good internal auditor without a qualification, of course, but it adds to the credibility, it adds to the confidence and the trust that stakeholders may have in us if they know that we are independently and objectively qualified through some sort of national or international certification scheme. Very, very important. But the third bit, again, is something that isn't always done as well as it should be. It talks about us being positioned at a level within the organisation that allows us to do our work properly and without interference. And again, in the past, some internal audit teams were not given the right status or the right position within an organisation. They were put within finance, perhaps a small team reporting to some sort of finance manager in the basement of the building, in the cold, in the dark, out of sight and out of mind. Well, nobody's going to take the internal audit team seriously if that's the position that they find themselves in. Why should I listen to you? Why should I do what you're telling me to do? Why should you even come here? I don't want to play with internal audit. Thank you very much. So it is really, really important for us and our ability to do our job properly to have the right reporting line to the very top of the organisation, to have the right qualifications to demonstrate credibility to those that we're reviewing, because we do a very, very important job. And thirdly, the right position within the organisation, the right seniority, if you like, that allows us to do our job without being diverted, without being resisted, without being obstructed by senior management or management in general, without interference. If you haven't got that now, and I know that not every audit function does, it's not always easy, this new set of standards gives you that opportunity to have those conversations again and to explain to people what the consequences are if we don't achieve this. We won't be able to conform with these standards, and we'll have to report that as an audit team and as an organization. Okay. Moving on then, we've got some standards that sit under this, and really it kind of repeats the message that I've given. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this. The board's responsible for enabling proper independence of the internal audit function. We've got a definition of what that means in practice, free from situations or conditions that could stop us carrying out our work objectively. We can't fulfill purpose unless we have that position. We have to confirm to the board our independence at least annually, so it's something we would put in our annual report. I'm doing these external assessments. I'm kind of looking for that sentence in annual reports that confirm organizational independence. But remember, we can't say it unless we achieve what the standards are requiring. So we should only declare our independence if we are truly independent and achieve what it says on this standard. Reporting directly to the board, qualify, positioned at a level that allows us to do our job. If we don't have that, we're not truly independent. Now I can see a raised hand. If that's for a question, Nino, could you pop it into the chat facility? I think that may be the easiest way of doing it at the moment. Oh, you're given permission. There we go. If you unmute yourself, Nino, you may well be able to ask your question. Fire away. Okay. Oh, let's see.
Yeah, maybe it was the hand was raised by mistake, or
No, I think there is a question. So, is there a way
yeah,
to unmute yourself, Nino, or can we unmute Nino and hear from her?
yeah, it's done now, I hope.
Nino, over to you. Easy questions, please. Okay, it's not coming through for some reason.
Not
I'm
coming
afraid.
for some reason. So maybe he can ask in the chat.
Yeah. Nino, I'm very sorry for whatever reason, probably the technology. We're not able to hear you give your question. So maybe if you could put it into the chat facility, I'll
Mm-hmm.
answer it
Yeah.
as soon as it comes through. Look, or I'll try to answer it. I apologize for that. Forgive us. Okay. While we're waiting for the question, I'll carry on talking. Time is always against us. Um, so um, we have to confirm this organizational independence, but we can't confirm it if we haven't got it. So that is something that we will all have to think about. And can I, with my hand on my heart, say that I have the organizational independence that I need? If not, we're going to have to explain that in our reporting, of course. We should also discuss any particular problems we've had where our independence has been impaired, where perhaps we have been resisted and we've been unable to do the work that we wanted to do. Right, a couple of questions I can see. Um, so yes, the material will be shared with you. Definitely,
Mm-hmm.
you'll get access to these slides in English, but do look at the Global Internal Audit Standards because all of this is coming from the standards themselves. We all have to read them, I'm afraid. So yes, thank you very much. You will get the material. And I've got another question. Is the recording going to be provided
Yes.
to you?
Mm-hmm.
Yes,
Yes.
it will.
Both the material, the presentation and the recording will be sent to all of you.
Thank you for confirming, Pilar. And that's why I'm on my best behavior today, because I know I'm being recorded. So that's why I'm being nice and polite and trying to speak positively today. There we go. Okay, just moving on. Um, we want let's pick on some of these roles and responsibilities that could impair our independence. Sometimes people want to give us other roles and responsibilities. Audit, can you help us with risk management? Audit, can you help us with fraud and investigations and punishing people? Well, we can do all of that. It's covered by some of our other standards, but it may have implications for our independence and objectivity, of course. If we're going to help the ministry or the organization implement risk management, we're going to facilitate that, then can I audit it in the future? Maybe not. Probably not, to tell you the truth. So we do need to think a little bit about safeguards and how to manage independence and objectivity if we're given other tasks. That needs to be clearly recorded. I would record it in the charter. So if we have responsibility for, say, risk management, I would expect to see that noted in our charter, and I would expect to see it stated that we can't then undertake internal audits of this because I own it or I'm leading it. So that needs to be clearly spelled out. We can do other things. It may not be perfect or ideal. We certainly can do other things, but we need to kind of think about the consequences and record this properly, of course. Okay, just reading the questions. Oh, I've had another question come through. They're coming through thick and fast now. Can I give some examples of interference in the internal audit function? I can absolutely give you probably several hours worth of conversations around interference. Um, Management can sometimes interfere with our work by cancelling interviews with us. That makes it difficult to do our work properly. People can interfere with our work by not providing the information that we're requesting in a timely way. This can cause delays. It may make it impossible to carry out the scope of the work that we're wanting to do. People can interfere in our work by not agreeing to fill vacancies in the audit team, by starving me of financial or human resources. That's interference in my work. It prevents me from delivering a good professional internal audit service in an organization. Those are 3 or 4 common examples. People can interfere with my work by refusing to agree, you know, the recommendations that we're making, by refusing to give comments on a draft report, all of which delays things and stops me from doing the work properly. And sadly, these situations can be quite common, and it's up to us to try to overcome these difficulties. Sometimes with courage that we mentioned about at the previous webinar that we had. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit more and go forward at a high level just to kind of cover off the remaining sections. So again, there are some potential conditions, some things that the board are going to have to do. Do make sure you have a read of those. It might be that the board have the role and responsibility for appointing and removing me as the head of internal audit. The board may have to have a role to play in my performance appraisal at the end of the day to provide the ability for me to do my job. properly and objectively, of course. It might be that we have to meet from time to time. Plenty of things and obligations on the board there. So do work through those. We're going to have to put these things in place. And if the board doesn't agree to this, we're going to have to try to persuade them and report on the consequences of this not being in place. On the impairment side, the Institute kindly explain a bit more detail the examples that I provided just a few minutes ago. Interference or impairments to us and our ability to do the work, limiting our scope, not giving us the data, records, or people that we need to do our job, resisting our findings and pushing back on the severity of our recommendations, reducing our budgets so that we can't get good people in to do the internal audit job. Plenty of interference, unfortunately. Very briefly, we mentioned this earlier because I do want to leave a bit of time for questions. The IA believes that heads of audit should be properly qualified. I wouldn't go to see a doctor if the doctor wasn't properly qualified. Why would we expect any different for heads of audit? They ought to be properly qualified in line with local or international good practices. The words are pretty clear, as you can see here. A question from Guram. Thank you again. Should the internal audit charter include some qualification sort of statements about the head of audit? What professional skills or education they should have to be appointed to the chief audit executive position? Very good question. It may well require a sentence in the charter. So in the UK, where I come from, there is an expectation under our public sector internal audit standards that are based on the II standards that heads of audit be properly qualified, either with a recognised internal audit qualification or a recognised accountancy qualification. And that's usually recorded in charters, yes. So I would expect charters to have something of that nature. The head of audit will be properly qualified in line with national requirements or in line with international certifications relevant to the role, something like that. Why not? Okay. So I hope that helps with that question. I'm going to leave the remaining questions as any other questions come in until the end now, because time is a little bit against us. Sorts of things here. What sort of qualifications, experience should the head of audit have? They ought to know the standards pretty well, and that's why all of you guys are on the call today to try to improve your understanding of these. Experience of leading and managing internal audit teams. And you'd expect the IA to say this, but to have some sort of CIA designation or other relevant professional education, etc., etc. Now, final section within this is about internal audit being overseen by the board. Much like the rest of my message today, this is about us having discussions with the board and making sure that they're aware of what we need from them and what they need to be doing in respect of us. The board should oversee the audit function, or rather the board oversees the audit function to ensure our effectiveness. You might say, well, I'm quite happy with the way things are. The board doesn't really bother too much about internal audit. They're not troubling us too much. We do our work. We can get on and do things that we want without people overseeing us too much. I like it that way. Well, yes, we might like it that way. It does give us freedom to do what we want without somebody sat on our shoulders or too much oversight or scrutiny. It doesn't mean it's the right thing. Okay. We need to be held to account just like any other function in an organization. If we're not being held to account, we're probably not going to be working quite as enthusiastically or quite as hard as we should be. If we know people are pecking on us, we'll work harder. And that's basically what this is trying to say, but in a nicer way. We need the board to be overseeing us. Why? To help ensure that we deliver our work to the standards and to the level of quality that we should be working to. So there we go. So the chief audit exec needs to provide the board with the information it needs to conduct its oversight responsibilities. I need to give them the plan. I need to tell them about changes to the plan. I need to give them the charter and tell them when the charter needs to be updated or reviewed. I need to tell them about the difficulties we're facing in delivering our work independently. And if some of those difficulties are caused by them, I need to be having that conversation with them. Because you're not giving us the additional resources we need, these are the problems that we're facing. Can you help us? We need to be talking about the results of our work and certainly the results of our quality assurance and improvement program. I mentioned this about the resources because this could be another difficult conversation. We need to evaluate whether we've got sufficient resources to deliver our mandate, that's one thing, and the plan. So this is us looking, saying, have I got enough resources to do what the purpose of internal auditing requires and what our organization needs from us? If not, we've got to come up with a plan to get these resources, a strategy with objectives, try to get these resources. And we need to talk to our minister or audit committee about what the consequences of not having sufficient resources means. This is what we're not able to do. These are the parts of the organization we can't look at because we don't have the right level of resources to do this. There are obligations on the board in this area, and we need, again, to be having that conversation with them in order to achieve this. We're nearly finished, so there is time for questions. The quality side of things, it's very similar to what exists under the current standards. We must, so it's not optional, develop, implement and maintain a quality assurance and improvement program. Covers every element of us and our work. So it's not just about supervising internal audits. It's about looking at the audit function and thinking, what are our priorities for improvement? What is it we need to focus on in order to be a better internal audit service this year, next year, and into the future? And we often forget about that strategic side of the improvement program. It's not just about supervising our audit team. So don't fall into that trap. The program also covers our internal assessments, which we'll talk about next time, but also our external assessments. And I know not every audit function in the world has had an external assessment, even in the UK, to be honest, certainly in the UK. Every audit function should have an external assessment. The standard is pretty similar to what is in place currently. We've got to develop a plan for this, discuss the plan with the board, and have an external assessment at least once every 5 years. And that doesn't mean once every 5 years. We can certainly have them more often because these are tools to help us improve and to get better at our job. So why wouldn't we have these more often? I know there can be cost implications, but we do have other options, perhaps around peer reviews. So why would we not want to kind of enjoy the opportunities that an external assessment provides? There are obligations that any external assessment team include somebody with at least one person with a CIA designation. So that is something to bear in mind when you're commissioning external assessments in the future. That's a change. Okay, we got there. I'm going to stop talking now, and I think we may have a question come through here. And the question that I'm looking at here, and please, if you've got other questions, now's the time to put them into the chat facility. We'll answer as many as we can. How can we use an internal audit function in CAF, C-A-F? I should know the answer to this, but I'm not sure what CAF stands for. Can somebody, Pilar, what does CAF stand for? I've heard the term, but I can't remember what it means. Any ideas? Anyone? CAF. I'm not sure what CAF or CAF means. And Alastair, can you remember? I've read the term somewhere, but I can't remember what it means.
CAF. I'm not honestly
CAF.
sure.
Okay, I'm glad it's not just me. I was thinking
Oh,
it might.
the Common Assessment Framework. Oh yeah, the Common Assessment Framework. Oh yeah.
That's something I'm not quite so familiar with. Is that something that either of you could assist in answering?
I'm not sure about that in terms of
Yeah.
how we could use internal audit in that, but I'm sure you could in some ways. I'd have to think about it a bit harder.
Okay, that's one that you managed to stump us with my anonymous questionnaire. That's a bit of a tough one. Not sure. I mean, I can talk generally about how organizations can, should be using internal audit to help them achieve important things. Obviously the work that we do can apply at different levels within an organization. And if there are externally commissioned reviews looking at aspects of our organization, then evidence that we've acquired through our internal audit work could potentially support some sort of assessment. Obviously meeting the assessors and giving them our views around governance, risk management and control could contribute towards any form of external assessment. And, obviously doing work that is meaningful and important and focusing on the things that matter in an organization, much more likely to give assurance to external assessors than if we're spending our time looking at things that aren't important or are too low level. Thank you. I can see that it's a European model for improving public organisation through self-assessment. If it's a self-assessment, we could facilitate that process on behalf of the organisation. I'm not familiar with the details of this particular model, and I apologise for that. But internal audit can be very well placed to help the organisation in these sorts of things because of our independent position and the objectivity that we often have when we're doing our work. So we would turn to a function we could trust to do these things well, and that may well be internal audit. So,
John, the CAF is like
yeah.
the EFQM model.
Brilliant. I mean, I used to do EFQM assessments previously, so I know very much about those. Yeah, we could facilitate the process for the organisation because, these assessments use the sort of skills that we have as auditors, and our independence and objectivity could again bring some trust and confidence into the assessment. If other people do the assessment, maybe we could review the way they did it and the evidence that they acquired to come up with the conclusions that they did. And so that review of the process they followed may give some assurance to our stakeholders as well. We could do it, we could review it. I hope that helps. Thank you for the question. You made us think on that one. So thank you. I now know what CAF means. Thank you. Any other questions, my friends? Oh, here we go. What is a minimum human resource to perform the audit function? Does it depend on various factors? Thank you, Nina. The minimum human resource to perform audit work. Minimum is one person. Okay, to be brutally honest. The maximum I've seen is 2,000 people, and I've seen everything in between. So, there are particular challenges of having small audit teams. We know that, particularly if we want to have a team that complies with or conforms with the standards. These standards, pretty demanding, they're pretty challenging, they require us to have lots of knowledge, skills, and experience. It's harder with a small team. It's not impossible. I've seen some very good, very small teams, and I've seen some pretty bad, very large teams, to tell you the truth. So it certainly isn't impossible. It's about the quality of the people in the team, I think, rather than, the numbers of people. There isn't a minimum number. Oh, well, there isn't a kind of ideal number. We do have to think about things like quality assurance over our work. There are one or two of us, and how that's going to work. We do need to think about skills and knowledge, efficiency and due professional care. So it's about, making sure that the resources we have are good, high quality, competent resources with the right attitude, and the right position and the right reporting lines. And then, even then, small team can do the work properly and in line with the spirit of the standards. So there we go. I've got a couple more questions. Is it the same for a quality assessment? Um, Not quite sure what that question means, Nino. When it comes to quality assurance, um, you know, if we're in a small team, we would have to think a little bit about how we review each other's work to ensure that we're issuing reports and have done enough work to justify our findings and opinions. It can be a challenge in a very small team, but it's certainly not impossible. And the standards do allow, and the Institute do allow for other people to potentially review our work if we are working on our own.
Just to say, John, I think in Sigma, we think we have a problem when the audit teams, audit units have one person because of the difficulty in actually complying with internal audit standards in terms
Well,
of
when it
quality,
comes,
in terms of quality control and things like that, and quality assurance, which is a challenge
yeah,
anyway, even when there's more than one person in the units at the moment.
it is. I think if you've got two people, then you can put in place a peer review process that would satisfy the institute, even if one of those people is reporting to the other one. We all sign up to a code of ethics that requires us to have objectivity and integrity. So, that ought to be the safeguard in a peer review type quality assurance or assessment over work. Now, it might be that if there is just one person within the team, that we look to some other mechanism within the organization to do that quality assurance over our work. The Institute accept that. It's not perfect, it's not ideal, but it is the option or an option, um, you know, if we're in that singleton position. Another option might be to involve, someone from a central function, like a central harmonization unit, to fulfill that quality control process, perhaps not for every audit, but for a sample of audits over the course of a year. So
Mhm.
there's always not ways round it, but ways of addressing some of the challenges. I think, from my perspective, there are probably bigger problems that we would face in complying with other standards if we were a one-person team. Quality control is, one part of it. There'll be plenty of other
Yeah.
difficulties we would have in meeting some of the
I,
other
I think
standards.
we have a general issue about meeting standards. I just use quality
Yeah,
as an example, and I
yeah,
think
yeah.
because there's
Fair
capacity
point.
issues in other parts of the system as well, I
Yeah,
think
of course.
that the view that we would propagate in Sigma is that this causes significant challenges and should be avoided. And there are probably a better
Yeah,
way to organize things than just having single person units, would be our perspective.
yeah, absolutely. Now, I agree. We've got a couple of other questions here. There's one from Salome. At the end of each chapter of the Global Internal Auditing Standards, I'm glad you've read them, Salome. Well done. There are compliance examples. Yes, there's examples of the sorts of things that we could do to demonstrate compliance. You're absolutely right. I've deliberately not included those, although I did mention them at the beginning of this talk. I wonder if we can use the above examples as a guide, and after execution, most of them to achieve general compliance with the standards. Um, yeah, that's basically why the Institute have included them, to show us the sorts of things that we could or should or must be doing in order to comply with them. So I don't think the institute wants to see them sort of thought of as a checklist. You know, you must do all of these things. That's not what they're there for. But they're certainly included to give you a bit of a steer, a bit of an example of the sorts of things that we could be doing in our organisation to demonstrate this. So, you know, yes, use them. Consider whether you're doing things that match these, and yes, that will certainly help you achieve greater levels of compliance than not doing them. I think is fair. I've got another question here. I'm just going to take a moment to read it. I'm not sure what extent you are familiar with supreme audit institutions. Well, I try not to work with them too much. No, I'm joking. I know quite a lot about them, but I'm not from that background. When it comes to their transparency and accountability, external audit of supreme audit institutions always is the number one option, since the standards emphasize the independence of internal audit. And internal audits be part of supreme audit institutions to ensure accountability, uh, blah. Does the presence of internal audit within the Supreme Audit institution compromise its independence? I think there's a lot of questions in there, really, and that may be beyond my ability to answer. I can talk from a UK perspective in that within the National Audit Office, there is a very small internal audit team whose job is to audit the National Audit Office. They audit the auditors. They're very small. You know, a team of about 2 or 3 people, I think it is. But you know, they do reviews of governance, of risk management, of control. I'm sure they do reviews of financial management and you know, key processes, and probably reviews of how the Supreme Audit institution teams do their work. So yes, you can have internal audit within these bodies, and obviously in different countries this is structured in different ways. It certainly does answer the question, who audits the auditors?
I can probably provide
Please.
more, being the external auditor that's here. And there's various models. You know, size Supreme Audit institutions probably should have some sort of internal audit function. Doesn't actually need to be in-house. It can be provided by another service, by another ministry and or other service, which I'd probably say is for smaller institutions is probably more appropriate. I don't think necessarily having an internal audit unit physically within the Supreme Audit institution is absolutely necessary. I worked in an institution. It was a regional Supreme Audit institution, but they didn't have their own internal audit function. It was contracted out for smalls. And another example is where it was part of the role of one of the external auditors to do the internal audit of the institution as well. They weren't involved in the management of the institution, but they were involved in audits that the institution did of external audits, but they also had the internal audit responsibilities for their own institution. So there's various methods, but this comes down to a scale issue, though, as well, from a large point of view. This is the problem of the challenge of having internal audit units in small institutions which don't have sufficient capacity in the first place, and whether there should be internal audit units in every institution, or whether there's other models to deliver an internal audit service for the public sector, such as shared service functions and other ways of doing it. But that's a bigger story.
Okay, thanks for that, Alastair. I've got one more question that I can see. Maybe this will be the final question. What are the differences between internal auditors in private and public sector if we apply the same principles and standards? I've got a good answer for that. There should be no difference at all, my friends. An absolutely reasonable question. These standards apply to large teams, small teams, public sector, private sector, international organizations. To my mind, a good auditor can move between sectors and can move between organizations. The audit skills are very, very similar. Of course, we may need particular specialist knowledge of rules, laws, regulations, compliance requirements, you know, the organization itself and its core business. Of course, that's important. But a good public sector auditor should have no problem working in the private sector and vice versa. People do move between sectors quite often in our world of internal audit, and standards apply to each sector universally. There we go. Okay, I've got no more questions come through.
Okay, is there any more questions before we conclude for today? A bit earlier than planned, but any other questions? Pilar? Oh, we've got another one.
Oh, there we go, as if by magic. What can be done in terms of auditing where there's only the head of the internal audit unit and no other auditors? When I first became a head of audit, I had no team. I was the first person in, and I spent a little bit of time writing my audit strategy and looking across the organisation, trying to understand how the organisation works. But I didn't just spend my time kind of, setting the function up. I did some audits myself to um, you know, to kind of understand how things worked in the organization, to be visible, have some deliverables, and to begin to deliver assurance. A single person can do audit work and lead the service for an organization. But remember, there are standards around resourcing, the standards around engaging with the board and understanding the board's assurance needs. One person may be insufficient, but it doesn't stop you doing good work and making a positive difference to governance, risk and control. Alastair, over to you. You wanted to say something, I think.
Oh, I've got a question for you.
Oh, question. Oh,
Yeah, sorry,
okay.
no.
Oh, right. I thought you were going to pitch in on the answer. I hope that kind of helps. It's not ideal, as we've said, to have a single person, but it doesn't stop us doing good work. It really doesn't. And if you're dedicated, if you're enthusiastic, if you use the standards to try to help you, you can begin to make a real difference in an organization. So I hope that helps. Alastair, sorry, a question.
Sorry, I was just seeing there's another question up about being accessed
Okay.
to previous sessions conducted on the new standards. Yes, they are on our LinkedIn page. They should be able to find links to our LinkedIn page. But maybe once we're finished with all the webinars, we'll provide a clear link to everything, all the outputs and the recordings as well, to make it easier to find and access at some point.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
That's something to think about. Okay. But I was going to ask you, John, a question about oversight of internal.
I thought I'd escaped from your questions.
Yeah, well, there's been lots of other questions today, so I haven't had to do so much work, which is always good from my perspective. But I do want to know your views about when we talk about oversight of internal audit, and we talk about the board overseeing the internal audit function to ensure that it functions effectively and delivers what it's supposed to do, which is great when you've got a nice independent board operating effectively. But we work in the public sector mainly.
Yeah.
And in environments where, or particularly in the central government sector, where you're working with ministers who may be your equivalent of the board. How can you ensure effective oversight in that situation, or what can you do to mitigate the risks of the political influence and what they want you to do and what they see as being efficient and effective, and all these good questions around that governance challenge that I think is quite a big issue for many people to think about.
Yeah, and it's certainly a very real problem, as you know, as we all know, and it isn't easy. There aren't easy answers to that. But last time we were talking a bit about courage and about kind of honesty and integrity, and I think there is the need to be brave and courageous and be willing to have difficult conversations with important people like ministers. Within this domain that we've been talking about today, there is a need for us to engage more, I think, regularly and more clearly and explicitly with key individuals, ministers, often in this case, around difficult issues like the resourcing of the audit service, like the ability of us to do our job properly and effectively. And I think, we as internal auditors ultimately have a choice here of either having those difficult conversations and explaining and talking and maybe facing a little bit of criticism or negativity, or not having those conversations. The standards expect us to be having those conversations, even if they aren't always easy, even if they, result in us being kicked out the office and sent away, and all of that. You know, we spoke earlier about the need to make it clear what the consequences are of not doing certain things in line with the standards, and I think we need to, have the courage to sit down and have those conversations and to make it clear to some of our stakeholders that, this can happen as a result. I'm not able to do this. We won't be able to do that. And ultimately, it may well be their decision at the end of the day. But being a little bit clearer about what the implications are, can potentially add a little bit of weight to some of our arguments and some of our conversations. It certainly isn't easy though, and you know, someone asked me the other week, if I'm in an organization that's really difficult, they don't get it, they don't understand, what should I do? And there isn't much that you can do at the end of the day. You either go along with it or you leave and try to find an organization that is better, and an organization where the culture is more willing to work with audit and understands the importance of governance, risk and control. And I know it's not always easy, but you know, we all have choices at the end of the day. Not an easy answer to that one, I'm afraid. Oh, you're muted, Alastair.
Sorry, I forgot I muted myself again. No, I don't think this one of these questions, one of those issues which there's no straightforward answer to, not easy. And we'll continue to search for solutions. And I think the reality is, in some of these cases, the solution is depends on the circumstance.
In the organization, not everyone is going to be bad or difficult, and again, it might be a case of trying to build a network of like-minded people that together could present a case for improvement or a case of to do things in a different way. That would be one other option, I suppose, as well. I'll shut up now.
I know that's quite a challenge for you to shut up at times, isn't it? Sorry, John and I work together a bit too much sometimes. Anyway, any final questions before I wrap up? Pilar, you got no questions today? No questions from Pilar. Okay, we'll leave it at that then, I think, and I'll just bring some conclusions to go. So thank you, John. You talked today about authorization by the board, or domain 3, about the governing of the internal audit services, which looks at the authorization by the board, how it's positioned independently, and the oversight of internal audit. So to an extent, we explored how internal audit is established by the board or approved and supports the internal audit function, whatever the board is in your circumstances. And we had a good insight in terms of thinking about ensuring that you know who your board or your senior management are and define that clearly up front. Is that the minister from your case for the board, or is it the head of the department or ministry that's your chief executive, who's your line manager, and things like that. So we explored that sort of issue. We explored setting the internal audit mandate, where you're looking at discussing and establishing the scope and type of work that you do and the services that will be provided. That may be through the law and in your circumstances, and that may be something that the CHUs or other functions need to think about in terms of updating if there's for the legal frameworks. And then we talk about revising the audit charter and updating that, and the need to do that effectively. And the need is also about ensuring we effectively engage with other insurance providers, both internal and external as well in this regard. And within this, the importance of board and management support for internal audit function. So the importance of your minister potentially, or of your senior head of your ministry, or head of the board, if you have a board, or the audit committee, in supporting the internal audit function and delivering its role. Then we look at talking about how we position internal audit independently, how it's to ensure that it's established in a way that protects the independence and of the internal audit function, and that it is appropriately qualified. So John looked at organizational independence, considering requirements around that, about whether other responsibilities impinge on that independence, and looking at considering the safeguards that can be put in place if you do have other roles and responsibilities apart from internal audit, and explore some of the limiting factors around independence. Then we also considered within this principle around chief audit qualifications, chief audit executive qualifications, or head of internal audit units, and the view that we think they should be qualified in some way. It's important to demonstrate that, and that this should be clearly set out in job descriptions and things like that. Then we looked at the final area we looked at was the oversight of the board, oversight of the internal audit function by the board is what we were talking about. And in this case, we could talk about oversight by the ministry, by the minister, maybe the equivalent of the board, but it might be by the board or an audit committee in your situation. And the importance of effective interaction that the head of internal audit has engaging with that oversight function in terms of providing plans and results of the audit work, the charters, and also raising issues and challenges or impediments to doing their work, amongst other things. And talking about ensuring about resources and ensuring that the head of internal audit is clear about challenges in resourcing, and ensuring that he has sufficient resources to fulfill their internal audit mandate and their strategies. Also talking about the responsibilities around quality and the responsibility to develop, implement, and maintain a quality assurance and improvement program that covers all aspects of the internal audit function. And then also, finally, we talked about external quality assessment requirements and the need to have one at least every 5 years. And I think that covers practically everything that we talked about today. Anything I missed there, John, Pilar? I think that was it.
No, it's a good summary, Alastair. There's just one thing I wanted to say, and I was asked not to say this, so I'm going to say it anyway. I'd just like to wish Tigran a very happy birthday.
Okay.
So there you go. Happy birthday.
Do you want to sing it as well, or should we just leave it at that?
No singing. That's
okay.
enough.
Okay, so thank you, John, for your, as usual, fantastic presentation of this domain. I just want to remind everybody that there are a couple of two more webinars coming up in relation to domains 4 and 5. The next one will be on the 17th of June at 9:30 Central European Time, where we will be looking at managing the internal audit function, where we'll be talking about strategies and planning the internal audit, ensuring efficient resources are in place to deliver the audit, communication and ensuring quality. So it'll be fascinating. And then on the 18th of September, we plan on at 1400 hours Central European Time, we'll be looking at performing internal audit services. That'll be the final planned webinar at the moment, although we may think of others in the near future. So please, the registration for the webinar on the 17th of June will be out early next week. So please register. And we look forward to seeing you then. I just want to say a couple of other thank yous. Thank you to Pilar, obviously, Ilana, our colleague, for organising and setting everything up. And obviously, on the final, thank you to John, again, for his excellent presentation. And also to all of you for joining us and taking part, and for the excellent questions that we got today. It was very good. Oh, a couple of more questions. I think there's maybe just thanking us. Yeah, Sonia's thank you. There's somebody's asking about CPD points. If you email us, we'll provide a certificate of attendance for CPD points, but you need to request it directly to us.
Yes, we don't do for all participants. So if you need one, please write to us.
Yeah.
Sometimes it takes a bit of time, but we will provide for it.
Okay. So thank you very much, and I wish you all a good day.